Well, thank you for inviting me. I mean, certainly it's appropriate to question the Star Spangled Banner as the national anthem. You may recall that it stems from the War of 1812, when once again the United States tried to seize Canada, not least because it was a sanctuary for fleeing enslaved Africans. And notoriously, the third stanza of the Star Spangled Banner singles out for reproach the Black community of the United States of America, which it seems to me should call for a severe revision of using those words, that anthem, forevermore. And in any case, Francis Scott Key, who was given credit for popularizing the lyrics, if not drafting them all together, was a notorious defender of enslavement of Africans. And so it's rather curious that you have Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene and Congresswoman Laura Boebert of Colorado, for example, reprimanding and rebuking the NFL for using Lift Every Voice and Sing, even though it is quite appropriate, not only as an anthem of struggle, but also because the NFL just happens to have a disproportionately Black workforce. You might have noticed that on the field at the Super Bowl yesterday. And in any case, the NFL obviously needs to do penance because it has continued to outlaw Colin Kaepernick, the former quarterback who protested police terror by taking a knee on the field, and ever since has been not allowed to practice his craft as a star quarterback. So once again, there were many issues that were deleted when this controversy arose about Lift Every Voice and Sing.
What I want to do is I want to go back to the motherland, if you will, to in earnest begin our conversation. I'm incensed. I'm incensed again by the issues that have arisen as we suffered regime change with Donald Trump. And what I mean by that is, just last week, Donald Trump, here we are in the middle of Black History Month. Just last week, Donald Trump accused South Africa of human rights violations against white farmers, Afrikaners, in a continuing dispute that escalated this week as the U.S. froze aid to the country. Now, the White House said Washington will also formulate a plan to resettle South African farmers and their families as refugees. It said U.S. officials will take steps to prioritize humanitarian relief, including admission and resettlement through the United States Refugee Admission Program for Afrikaners from South Africa. Oh, my goodness. What do we make of this? We're looking at Black History Month, but it has to operate and function within the era of this new oligarch that has seized control of this government.
Well, to begin with, as is well known, there are a number of so-called refugees from apartheid South Africa who are playing an ever more important and ever more strategic role in Washington, D.C., starting with Elon Mussolini, that is to say, the man who notoriously gave a fascist salute and therefore was emulating Benito Mussolini, the founding father of fascism in Italy in the 1920s. But it does not stop there. Recall Peter Thiel, who grew up in South African illegally occupied Namibia, in addition to Johannesburg, before decamping to Silicon Valley, becoming filthy rich and helping to propel the political career of present Vice President J.D. Vance, of course, helping to fund Mr. Trump in 2016. There's David Sachs, another refugee from apartheid, who is the crypto and AI czar in the White House, Joel Pollak, who has been mentioned as a possible U.S. ambassador to South Africa, returning to his homeland. Of course, he is too a refugee from South African apartheid. But it's even more ominous and dangerous than that, because South Africa is in the crosshairs because it had the gumption to drag U.S. ally Israel before the International Court of Justice, where the jurists basically ruled that they made out a plausible case for genocide. That is to say, what Israel has done in terms of its depredations in Gaza. South Africa is a leading member of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Its number one trading partner is China. That has raised eyebrows, to put it mildly, in Washington. But as well, keep in mind that the African National Congress government that came to power in 1994 has maintained a close alliance with the Communist Party of South Africa, which holds important ministerial portfolios. And despite the erosion of Cold War I, we're now in Cold War II, where the Communist Party of China is in the crosshairs, and therefore the Communist Party of South Africa's role in Pretoria is viewed with disdain in the White House. We should also keep in mind that of late, South Africa has come into conflict with Rwanda. South Africa has dispatched troops to the eastern Congo, where a number have been slain at the hands of the so-called M23 backed by Kigali. That led to an intense verbal spat between President Kagame of Rwanda and President Ramaphosa of South Africa. Recall as well that Rwanda, at the invitation of the government of Mozambique, the important neighbor to the north of South Africa, sent troops to Mozambique, that Southeast African nation, to beat back a religious insurgency that also was threatening an important French energy investment. And so, given the fact that Rwanda has become a kind of fair-haired donor recipient of aid from the North Atlantic Bloc, and in fact from Israel as well, if press reports can be believed, we should take this conflict with South Africa very seriously and not necessarily dismiss it as trivial, particularly since we also know that the last foreign trip of Mr. Trump's predecessor, Mr. Biden, was a trip precisely to Angola. And we had said at the time that this was also part of a diabolical plan to encircle South Africa. And so this latest maneuver by the Trump White House, by basically saying that even though the United States constitutionally has the power of eminent domain, that is to say, if Mr. Trump wants to build a wall on the Texas-Mexico border, he can expropriate landowners for a governmental purpose, but somehow South Africa does not have the right to have a so-called power of eminent domain. Now, this law that has been objected to has not been executed, but once again, we also have lived through the very dispiriting experience of what befell Zimbabwe. South Africa's neighbor to the north, when engaged in land reform, it was punished with pulverizing sanctions, not only by the United States and the UK, but Australia as well, an attempt to drive the economy into the ditch from which Zimbabwe has yet to recover. And one does not have to be necessarily an oracle to predict that a similar fate awaits South Africa unless our community can mobilize sufficiently.
Do you see points of enormous distinction between the Biden administration and the Trump administration in its relationship to crushing Africa as we now see in the Sahel area, where the vestiges of colonialism are being fought against, and indeed the French have been unceremoniously ousted from a number of countries. Is there a meaningful departure? Is it a worsening? Or has U.S. policy remained fairly consistent, even with the likes of a former Afrikaner like Elon Musk, richest man in the world, really calling the shots?
Well, it's too soon to tell. Trump 2.0 has only been holding office for about, let us say, 18 days or so.
Seems like an eternity, doesn't it?
Yeah, right. And so we do know that, for example, there has been bombing by the Trump administration, the Trump regime, of so-called religious zealots in Somalia. There's been talk about the Trump regime recognizing the breakaway province of Somaliland because it sits across the Red Sea from the Yemenis, who have raised the ire of the Israelis by sending missiles into Tel Aviv, basically shutting down the port of Eilat. I dare say that both the Trump administration and the Biden administration will try to take advantage of the French ouster from the Sahel region by seeking to curry favor with those regimes, or alternatively seeking to overthrow them if they do not accept the favors that are proffered. But once again, it's really too soon to tell. Although when we analyze these two administrations, we should not necessarily personalize the issue and see it solely as an issue of personal predilection. We should look at the base of these two regimes. And it's no secret that Mr. Biden received a significant percentage of Black American votes. And even though Trans-Africa and the Black American foreign policy lobby has gone into the dustbin of history, there is still a lingering concern amongst the Black American constituency about the fate of Africa that a Mr. Biden would have to be more sensitive to than a Mr. Trump, respectively.
So now I want to head back, although we've never left the U.S. since its hegemonistic imperialist endeavors have its ugly fingerprints all over the globe. But I want to head to the United States. So every February, we observe in the recent years Black History Month. It's a time to set aside, commemorate, and highlight the important contributions made by people of African ancestry over the years, to provide a more thorough acknowledgement of Black history and culture, which historian Carter Woodson, who had founded Negro History Week in 1926, extended to a month-long celebration in 1976. So Black History Month is significant. It can help people learn about the varied and rich experiences of people of African ancestry, while also recognizing the hardships and celebrating their victories. It provides a chance to draw attention to stories that have frequently been ignored or undervalued, promoting a more comprehensive view of American history. But that's the rub. To understand American history as not American exceptionalism. So I'm wondering about your thoughts as we live at a time now where they want us to forget. They want us to forget part of our history, the indigenous, the African American experience. So your thoughts on what we should be focusing on and the importance of Black History Month.
Well, certainly Black History Month, as well as Black August, which is a sort of a complementary observance of Black history, that takes place during the month of August, singling out the question of political prisoners, those like the late George Jackson. All of these particular celebrations need to be lifted up. But I dare say that the celebration of Black History Month has been handicapped to a certain degree, as I infer from your comment about putting in the context of U.S. history, because the construction of U.S. history has been rather weak, if I must say so myself, including the contributions by some of our friends on the left. What I mean by that is that the construction of U.S. history routinely has ignored the question of settler colonialism, believe it or not. It's not until quite recently that descriptor has entered a limited sector of the vocabulary of the U.S. left, although obviously you cannot begin to understand the preceding discourse that we just engaged in with regard to South Africa, another settler colonial society, and Mr. Trump reaching across the Atlantic in solidarity, settler solidarity. You can't understand that unless you understand settler colonialism in North America. Likewise, when Mr. Trump had his notorious press conference alongside Mr. Netanyahu and pledged that the Pentagon would do the dirty work of the Israelis in Gaza by engaging in ethnic cleansing, that was another exemplar of settler colonialism. But once again, settler colonialism has not been in the forefront of discussions of U.S. history, even by some of our friends on the left, even though I don't think you can begin to understand the present crisis, this so-called constitutional crisis, which is really a counter-revolutionary moment that could easily tip into fascism, without understanding not only settler colonialism, but settler colonialism being based and grounded in class collaboration. That is to say, as the histories I have written and the histories that others, or a few others have written, have tended to suggest, when England began to dispatch settlers across the Atlantic, it was a heterogeneous crew of shopkeepers, workers, declass elements, lumpen elements, all funded by the 1% in London, but all pledged to engage in mutual enrichment by uprooting the indigenous population, taking their land, and with a little bit of luck and a lot of pluck, dragging Africans kicking and screaming across the Atlantic to work for free. And so this was a kind of class collaboration, which was then complemented, if you like, by the class collaboration of the racial identity of the settlers. That is to say, the construction of whiteness, where those who had been warring on the shores of Europe, initially English versus Irish, and English versus Scots, and English versus Welsh, and then British versus German, German versus Pole, Pole versus Russian, Serb versus Croat, Northern Italian versus Southern Italian, even expanding its remit to include Egyptian Christians, Lebanese Christians like Ralph Nader, all under this umbrella of whiteness, which is a sort of class collaborationist identity. So you have class collaborationism squared with regard to the construction of the United States of America. At the same time, the Black population, the unpaid sector of the working class, by dint of the persecution and oppression they were faced with, was forced to engage in class struggle, including resistance, including malingering, including uprisings, including, as we said at the top, collaborating with the Redcoats during the War of 1812 when they joined hands to torch Washington, D.C., sending James Madison, the president, and his garrulous spouse Dolly's fleeing into the streets one step ahead of the posse. The problem is that class struggle and class collaboration do not mix very well. And this issue of class struggle amongst the population of African descent has been one more reason for this population to be persecuted, to be subjected to atrocities, to be oppressed. And unfortunately, once again, I'm not sure if many of our friends on the left have been capable of depicting what I just described, which means that Black History Month oftentimes has devolved into celebrations of the first Black airline pilot or the first black president, et cetera. I will not necessarily denigrate that, but it does a disservice to this history of struggle and is rather one-sided as a result.
Well, I want you to continue to develop the theme here. And I will tell people, in case you do not know, and you should, but you will from now on, that you're listening to Dr. Gerald Horne, one of the world's greatest historians, barring none, who has joined with us to help us understand what he particularly specializes in as part of his research and unearthing, and that is the relationship between race and class, which are strung together and must be strung together to understand the evolution of capitalism and to understand the evolution of the maintenance of capitalism, plantation capitalism, by the ideology of white supremacy. So our historian here is to unearth for us and give us the foundation to go forward, the research that he has plugged away in for years, and we are delighted to have on Equal Rights and Justice and on Building Bridges, Dr. Gerald Horne. Now, I want to just take it to understand the kind of evolution from colonial labor to slave labor to the evolution of the black working class struggle, and what you think are the issues that must be addressed today, and how we begin to look at those in the era of Trump, which I consider to be an era I would debate whether it's encroaching fascism or whether indeed it is a fascism that has already been consolidated under this oligarchic led government. But your thoughts on and take us from that period and what the issues are of African Americans in the labor force.
Well, first of all, we have to understand the colonial period. That is to say, the period before the so-called independence of the United States post 1776. That is to say, in order to understand the true history of the United States, you have to understand the interrelationship between religion, race, and class. That is to say that as England is beginning to send its settlers across the Atlantic, it's in the context of sharp religious conflict, not least between Protestants and Catholics, Protestant London and Catholic Spain. For the most part, the Protestants were the scrappy underdogs. They barely escaped having their regime in London overthrown in the late 1580s by the Catholic invaders. And so improvisationally, as I just suggested a moment ago, you saw the Protestants move away from religion as a major marker of society to race. That is to say, this wall thrown up between those of European descent and the rest of us. Keep in mind that in Spanish Cuba, for example, beginning in the 1500s, you had African conquistadors. However, they professed Catholicism, religion being the major marker of society, whereas the Protestants moved towards race, but then the race project was dented severely, if not toppled altogether, progressively, by the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, a successful revolution of the unpaid sector of the working class. And it's rather scandalous that it has not been seen that way by those who consider themselves to be revolutionary. Of course, the late, great C.L.R. James, the Trinidadian scholar, a conspicuous exception with his book, The Black Jacobins. It's no accident that with the success of the Haitian Revolution, which then leads to a crisis generally of the slave system, in North America, leading to its overthrow in 1865, you begin to see the flowering of trade union movements. You begin to see the onset of the 8-hour day delivered by this very same trade union movement, then eventuating in the ultimate class project, which is the construction of social societies in the 20th century and going forward into the 21st century. And so in order to understand the Black working class, you have to understand this transition from religion to race to class, from being an unpaid sector of the working class to being on the bottom rung of the ladder of the working class, which then brings us to Mr. Trump, felon number 47, as you put it, who in one of his first acts delivered withering blows, not only to the Black working class, but to those who also occupy the bottom rung of the socioeconomic ladder. For example, the undocumented migrant population, for example, which is in the process of being deported to Guantanamo, in the process of being sent to the four corners of planet Earth. You saw this attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion, complementing the U.S. Supreme Court's attack on affirmative action in its cases involving University of North Carolina and Chapel Hill and Harvard University some months ago, despite the fact that some of our so-called friends on the left have saluted this attack on diversity, equity, inclusion because they see it as blunting the class struggle. The fact of the matter is that what they're basically doing is surrendering to this abomination of a reality that there are those who, by dint of their ancestry, should be on the bottom rung of the socioeconomic ladder, because these measures, these reform measures like affirmative action and diversity, equity, inclusion, they're designed, in a sense, to do an end run around the formidable barriers of white supremacy that continue to bedevil us. It's not just a matter of handing out favors to Black people, for example. It's a way to try to circumvent institutionalized racism. And the fact that that cannot be grasped is, once again, one more bit of evidence that tends to help us to understand why we might be on the verge of fascism, if not in the foothills already.
Dr. Horne, a moment ago I said, and I insist, that yes, they want us to forget. They want us to forget. Thus, the right attacks on critical race theory, which would advance us, educate us, organize us, which is much more than just Black history. It has a specific purpose that was generally used within the context of the law, which is to understand the state policies and practices of racism that informed much of our legal policy, our legal theory, and our policy and practice. So they want us to forget. They want us to forget and attack critical race theory, and they, of course, burn books. And one of the things that was just is so interesting to me is, even at a time like this, the 21st century, just the other day, for example, an institution like West Point, it had 12 cadet clubs, including the Society of Black Engineers and other affinity groups, that were dissolved as a result of the administration's executive order to dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion, which actually was a replacement for affirmative action without the strength of mandate. But we had at least diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. And now throughout federal institutions, even an institution like West Bank. Why do I say even? Because it was so strategic to the system itself to begin to diversify institutions like West Point. So your thoughts on really how frightening, how much up against the wall we are, that racism and xenophobia are the keys to the maintenance of power by these new oligarchs, and thus the dismantling of diversity, equity, inclusion, and the like.
I should also mention that the scandal-ridden Pentagon chief, Pete Hegseth, in his bombarding of DEI in the Pentagon, also ruled that there should be no observance of Holocaust Remembrance Day, for example. And given the fascist salutes offered by Elon Mussolini, I think that we should not neglect that particular chapter as well. Likewise, it's interesting that right now there's talk about a constitutional crisis because J.D. Vance and others of his ilk are talking about not observing the rulings of federal courts. Well, it's interesting to note that in its opinion overthrowing affirmative action at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and at Harvard, the U.S. Supreme Court carved out an exception for the military academies, for West Point, for Annapolis, the U.S. Naval Academy, for the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. Obviously, Pete Hegseth has thumbed his nose at that particular decision, and it will be interesting to see if that case reaches the high court once again. Will the high court stand by its original opinion, or will it capitulate? Will it fold like a cheap suit in the face of this Trump-Hegseth offensive? It's even more curious because we also know that the U.S. military, which has ambitious goals, Mr. Trump just said that they might be deployed to Gaza to engage in ethnic cleansing so he could construct this so-called Riviera on the Mediterranean. Yet the U.S. military, quite fortunately, in my opinion, is having trouble meeting its recruitment goals. And I think that this is part of the erratic helter-skelter policy of the Trump team. That is to say that engaging in conflict with its northern neighbor, speaking of Canada, without considering the downside risk of having an unfriendly neighbor on a border that stretches for thousands of miles. I think that the unwise from the point of view even of a sober U.S. ruling class, these unwise policies are to a certain extent, or a response to the weakening of U.S. imperialism in the face of the stiff challenge presented by the People's Republic of China, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, recently co-opting Indonesia, the largest predominantly Islamic country on planet Earth, not to mention Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Cuba, etc. And so I think that the ordinarily erratic Mr. Trump has become even more erratic given this stiff challenge. The problem is that we are now stuck on this ship of fools with Admiral Wrong-Way Peach Fuzz at the steering wheel, and therefore we're headed for an iceberg. If we're not careful, he will crash us all.
Gerald Horne, you referenced, and we should delve deeper, the issue of class collaboration. But I want to speak as part of that to people who now, and there are growing numbers of them who pretend to be center left or on the left, who have really capitulated to, and I think collaborated with the right by taking positions, for example, that terrifyingly xenophobic, capitulationist positions that the new immigrant workforce, albeit without papers, if we support them, that is splitting the working class, as the working class now is, the U.S. working class is, quote unquote, largely precariat. And these are people, the new immigrants that are coming in, who would take their jobs, and they do so with less likelihood, presumably, of joining a union, and also working with significantly diminished wages. So therefore, that it's splitting the working class, it's alienating the working class, and those of us who want to be organizers have to understand that, and they are lowering the wages of the working class. So in the midst of Black History Month and so on, what do we say to people who have that position, or people, for example, like Bernie Sanders, who never effectuated an operational position around affirmative action, and similarly said that was splitting the working class? So what do we say to our white, in quote, comrades who have betrayed the self-determination, the liberation struggle, and the struggle against white supremacy that the African-American population has risked all for since it was dragooned to these shores? What's the message there?
Well, I'm afraid to say that inglorious tradition is deeply rooted in the soil of the construction of the United States of America. You need look no further than the U.S. Civil War, whereby the so-called Confederate States of America, which sought to secede from the United States of America in order to perpetuate the enslavement of Africans forevermore, the fighting force was disproportionately comprised of working class Euro-Americans who in many ways were fighting to ensure that an enslaved population would continue to persist that would serve as a drag on their own wages. And in fact, a wise employer might decide that it made more sense to hire an unpaid African enslaved worker than a Euro-American, albeit racist Euro-American, who demanded wages. I think that we thought that we had learned the lesson of those sorts of wrong-headed, misguided policies in the 1930s, when you had the rise of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, which had left-leaning, including communist leadership, which fought to organize workers across the board, going against the grain of the pre-existing American Federation of Labor, which tended to organize only the skilled craft workers, who tended heavily to be Euro-American. The CIO tended to organize Black workers, who oftentimes were at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale. They were somewhat successful in that regard, and that led to many positive spinoffs, including the establishment of unemployment compensation, which fortunately is still with us as of today, not to mention Social Security, et cetera. But it seems that we have to learn and relearn these lessons every few generations. And as I've tried to indicate, I think it's because the nation was built on class collaboration and a certain kind of right opportunism, and that has been a dominant current. And therefore, it's not surprising that some of the individuals that you mentioned continue to capitulate, continue to surrender to these backward kinds of ideologies, despite the historical lessons that I've just laid before you.
So the agenda for struggle in the time we have left, at least we be disheartened by the panoply of executive orders which trummel people daily, and will most seriously have its effect on the impoverished populations, on the populations of color, and so on. What do you see as the tasks before us now to build a formidable response to both the backlash and to take us beyond that, to beat back the Trump attack and to move forward, to really move forward for the populations that have been most oppressed within this society? The African American population, the Latinx populations, the people of African ancestry and the people of Asian ancestry, the indigenous people. How do you see? Is it about building a big tent? Is that even possible given the continuation of white supremacy that exists within the ranks of the left? I mean, where do we go from here, my friend?
Well, since this is Black History Month, let me start with that point. That is to say, it's incumbent, I would argue, on behalf of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the largest mass organization to this very day amongst Black Americans, to rethink its sellout of those to its left, led by the late, great Paul Robeson, who those of his ilk were tossed overboard in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions. Obviously, that bargain has long since expired. And I would urge the NAACP to rethink and walk back that fateful decision, which has led us, quite frankly, to the precipice of disaster. Likewise, we should revive this tradition of internationalism, not only amongst the NAACP, which should relearn the lesson of how we were able to escape slavery through the alliance with Haitian revolutionaries and British abolitionists, how we are able to erode Jim Crow because of the rise of a socialist camp and the rise of African liberation movements, and both putting pressure on Washington to retreat from the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow. As we speak, you have a very important development that's unfolding, and that is to say the alienation of Canada. You already have auto workers with members on both sides of the border, the Canadian auto workers and the United Auto Workers. But I would argue that all of the mass organizations in the United States of America, not only unions, should begin to reach across the border, because there is a mass anti-U.S. imperialist movement developing north of the border that will be a monumental consequence. And of course, if you raise that question of anti-imperialism, you should not stop with Canada, obviously. You should raise the question of solidarity with Cuba, whose importance will be magnified given its alliance with the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the envisioning of the Port of Mariel as sort of a hub to help to revive economies in Jamaica, Haiti, going as far south as Grenada, for example, whose prime minister just spent a week in the People's Republic of China. So I think that the task before us are rather obvious and clear. The question is our leadership up to the task? And if they're not, perhaps new leadership is in order.
Well, we've been speaking with Dr. Gerald Horne, whom the late anti-racist advocate, author, historian William Loren Katz described as a national treasure. And I would insist really that if we take the process of equal rights and justice seriously, that to get to that point, we need to educate ourselves, and then educate ourselves with people like Dr. Gerald Horne, who are agitators, who understand that it's not the backlash is the white backlash that we have to fight against. So really, Google any one of Dr. Gerald Horne's books so that we can educate, agitate, and organize ourselves to beat back the Trump attack, which is synonymous with xenophobism, with racism, with misogyny, with all those biases that careerist politicians, dictators, autocrats build their careers and are now building the government upon. So we've got a lot of work to do, and we really want to thank you. But I want to ask you one other thing, and that is the importance of the media. And yes, I'm getting to the issue of why independent, non-commercial media like WBAI, like PFW, like all the Pacifica stations plus have to be protected. I mean, what is freedom of speech and freedom of a righteous advocacy media worth that it must now be supported in the era of Trump more than ever before?
Well, I think the reasons are obvious. If you look at the so-called corporate media, it's unclear whether they will survive in the next decade or so, or even survive the Trump regime. You see ABC, for example, paying out millions of dollars to Mr. Trump based upon what amounted to a fraudulent lawsuit. CBS apparently about to do the same thing because of fraudulent allegations about slippery editing with an interview with Vice President Kamala Harris a few months ago. CNN hit with libel suits, and of course, their continued existence is rather shaky, not to mention the continued existence of NPR and PBS, which obviously are on the chopping block or about to be fed into the wood chipper, as Mr. Elon Musk would put it. And that leaves us with Pacifica, which fortunately has a different kind of business model that's heavily dependent upon the good wishes of listeners who crave the kind of music and analysis and history that we provide. But that business model, of course, is also under attack given the attacks on nonprofits by the Trump-Musk regime. And so I urge and encourage any within range of my voice to pick up the phone and dial or go to the secure website of WBAI or WPFW and make a secure pledge to ensure the continued existence of these oases of relevance in a parched desert of misinformation and disinformation.
And I just want to probe a little further, given the fact that I'm talking to one of the penultimate historians. What the heck does it mean when we have completely had a sensorial relationship with, when we've crushed the media, which is the fourth estate and the only entity now that in just a minute or two that we have left that can be a critic and guide us in the struggle to beat back the Trump attack?
Well, I think it'll obviously raise the stock price of Fox News. It'll raise the stock price of the Rupert Murdoch empire, which also includes the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post. But of course, we're not going to let that happen. We refuse to allow that to happen, because if we were somehow to allow that to happen, we'd be one step closer to a kind of fascism that would make the era of Jim Crow and slavery perhaps seem tame by comparison.
Well, Dr. Gerald Horne, we thank you so much.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.